Hannah Brooks didn't flinch when Tempest's hoof cracked the fence rail 6 inches from her skull. She rose from the dirt blood on her lip and walked straight back toward the mare that had already crippled 2 grown men. Silas Boone screamed at her to get out before she got herself killed. Hannah didn't look back at him. She looked only at the horse. "You don't scare me," she whispered. "I've already buried the worst thing that could happen to me." Nobody at Mason Ridge Ranch had ever seen a woman walk toward death and call it nothing. Before we continue, if this story is pulling you in, already hit that subscribe button and stay with me. Clear to the end. I pour everything into these stories for you. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I love seeing just how far these stories travel. Now let's begin. The dust hadn't even settled from her boots when the laughter started. Hannah Brooks stood at the gate of Mason Ridge Ranch with her carpetbag hanging off one shoulder, her navy dress soaked through at the collar from 7 miles of walking under a Wyoming sun that didn't care whether a woman was recently widowed or recently born. She hadn't eaten since the day before. She hadn't slept properly in longer than that. But she stood straight, and she looked the foreman dead in the eye when she asked for work. Silas Boone spat into the dirt near her boots. "Work," he repeated like the word tasted wrong in his mouth. "You hear that boy's lady wants work." 3 ranch hands leaning against the barn straightened up to get a better look, grinning like she was the first entertainment they'd had in a month. "I can cook, I can keep books, and I know horses better than any man on this ranch," Hannah said. Her voice didn't shake. She'd promised herself back on the road that it wouldn't. "Horses," Silas said, and laughed outright, now a short, ugly bark of a sound. "Sweetheart, we got men here who've broke Mustangs since before you were born. What we don't need is some grieving widow woman fainting in a stall and getting herself trampled. I haven't fainted once in my life. There's a first time for everything." "Not for me." That stopped him for half a second. Just half a second. Then he waved a hand like he was swatting a fly. "Go on, head back to town. There's a boarding house takes in women like you. Cooking, cleaning, that's honest work for a lady alone. This here's a cattle operation. I didn't come for cleaning." "Didn't ask what you came for." Hannah set her carpet bag down in the dirt. Not because she was giving up. Because she needed both hands free, and some part of her, the part that had learned over the last hard year exactly how much a person could survive, understood that this conversation wasn't finished. "My husband died 8 months ago," she said. "Fever took him in 11 days. I buried him myself because there wasn't a soul left on our land to help me dig. I kept that ranch running alone for 6 months after fed the stock, mended the fence, balanced the books to the penny, until the bank decided a widow with no sons wasn't worth the paper her deed was written on. So don't tell me what kind of work is honest for a lady alone, Mr. Boone. I've already done the hardest work there is." Silence. One of the ranch hands, a lanky boy who couldn't have been past 19, looked down at his boots like he was suddenly ashamed of something. Silas didn't look ashamed. He looked annoyed, the particular annoyance of a man who'd been handed a fact he had no argument for and hated her for it. "That's a real sad story," he said, though nothing in his tone suggested he found it sad. "Don't change the facts. Get off Mason land before I have to make you." "Make me." He took a step forward. That was when the voice cut through the yard quiet, but the kind of quiet that made every man within earshot stop moving. "Silas." Luke Mason came around the side of the barn with a coil of rope over one shoulder and dust on his forearms, the look of a man who'd been working since before sunup and would be working long after sundown. He was tall in the way that didn't announce itself, the way of a man who'd stopped needing to prove his size a long time ago. His eyes went from his foreman to the woman standing her ground in the dirt, and something in his face didn't match the scene in front of him. No scorn, no impatience. Just attention. "She's trespassing," Silas said. "Told her to move on." "Didn't ask you," Luke said, not unkindly but final. He walked closer to Hannah, close enough that she had to tilt her chin up slightly to meet his eyes, and for a moment, nobody in that yard said a word. "What can you actually do?" he asked her. "Not who are you? Not where are you from? What can you actually do?" Hannah felt something in her chest loosen for the first time in 8 months. Not relief, not yet, but the small, dangerous permission to hope that maybe this one man would ask the right question. "Show me your hardest horse," she said. Silas laughed again, but it came out thinner this time. "Boss, you can't be serious." "I am," Luke said, still looking at Hannah. "Follow me." They walked past the bunkhouse, past the water trough, past 3 more ranch hands who abandoned whatever they'd been doing to trail along behind, like the whole outfit smelled a spectacle coming. Hannah kept her spine straight and her eyes forward. She could feel every one of their stares on her back, weighing her, already deciding she'd fail. The paddock at the far end of the property was separated from the others by an extra rail of fencing, and even from 30 feet away, Hannah could see why. The black mare inside was pacing the fence line with her ears pinned flat, her whole body coiled tight as a rattler about to strike. Sweat darkened her neck even though the morning wasn't that hot yet. There were scars on her flank, old ones, the kind that came from spurs, not accidents. "Tempest," Luke said. "Bought her 8 months back off a man in Cheyenne who couldn't handle her and didn't much care what happened to her after he sold her off. Best bloodline in the territory. Also put 3 of my best men in the doctor's care trying to get a saddle near her." He paused. "Trying to shoe her's worse. Last farrier who tried, she broke his arm in 2 places. Nobody within 40 miles will touch her now." "Why not just get rid of her?" "Because underneath all that, there's the finest horse I've ever seen," Luke said. "I'm not in the business of throwing away something good just because it's difficult." Hannah looked at him for a long moment. There was something underneath his words that had nothing to do with the horse and everything to do with a man who'd learned somewhere along the way exactly how easy it was for the world to discard something or someone simply for being hard to handle. She didn't ask what had taught him that lesson. Not yet. Silas planted himself at the fence rail with his arms crossed. "This is a mistake. Let her decide that herself," Luke said. Hannah handed Luke her carpet bag without looking at him, climbed onto the second rail of the fence, and swung her leg over. "Ma'am?" One of the younger hands started. "Miss Brooks." Silas snapped, some ugly satisfaction creeping into his voice now, like he'd been waiting for exactly this. "That mare will kill you before you take 3 steps." "Then I reckon you'll have 1 less lady to complain about," Hannah said, and dropped down into the paddock. The mare's head snapped toward her instantly. Every muscle in that black body went rigid. Hannah didn't move toward her. She didn't move away either. She simply stood, her hands loose and open at her sides, and let the horse look at her. "Get out of there," Silas barked. "Boss, call her out. This ain't worth—" "Quiet," Luke said low, and for the first time there was steel underneath the calm. Tempest's ears flicked. Pinned back, then forward, then back again. The fight going on inside her, plain to see for anyone who knew how to read a frightened animal. Hannah had spent a lifetime learning exactly that. "I know," Hannah said softly, not moving an inch closer. "I know what it is to have men decide what you're worth, without ever asking you a single question. I know what it is to be handled instead of heard." The mare's nostrils flared. One front hoof struck the ground, a warning. "Don't worry," Hannah whispered. "I'm not here to conquer you." For 3 full seconds, nothing moved in that paddock. Then Tempest screamed a high, furious sound and charged. Every man at the fence shouted at once. Silas lunged for the gate latch. Luke was already moving 1 boot on the bottom rail, ready to vault the fence himself, his face gone white in a way that had nothing to do with horses, and everything to do with watching something terrible happen twice in one lifetime. Hannah didn't run. She turned sideways, dropped her shoulder, and simply stepped out of the mare's direct line, the way she'd learned from her father 30 years ago, on a ranch that no longer belonged to anyone in her family. Tempest thundered past her close enough that Hannah felt the wind off her flank, close enough that a lock of Hannah's hair came loose from its pins. The mare wheeled at the far fence, chest heaving, and spun back around to face her again. "Hannah?" Luke's voice raw, no longer calm at all. "Get out of there now." Hannah didn't answer him. She kept her eyes on the horse. "You're not angry," she said, quiet, steady, though her heart was slamming against her ribs hard enough to hurt. "You're scared. And every single time you've shown someone that fear, they've called it something else. Meanness, danger, a problem to be broken. She took one slow step forward. Just one. I'm not going to break you. Tempest's ears came forward, just slightly, just enough. Hannah, so help me. Luke had one leg over the fence now. Don't, Hannah said without turning around. If you come in here now after she's already decided I might not be a threat, you'll undo it. Please, trust me. Luke froze with his leg still hooked over the top rail, his whole body coiled to move, and something in Hannah's voice, the plainness of it, the lack of any performance in it made him stop. Silas hadn't stopped shouting. This is madness, boss. She's going to get herself. I said quiet, Luke snapped, and this time it cracked like a whip across the yard, and even Silas went silent, jaw-tight hands white-knuckled on the fence rail. Hannah took another step. Tempest's whole body trembled, but she didn't run, didn't charge again. Her ears stayed forward. Her breath came in great heaving pulls, but she held her ground, and so did Hannah, until barely 4 feet separated them close enough now that if the mare struck out, there would be no stepping away from it. I buried my husband alone, Hannah said so quietly now that only the horse could truly hear it. I dug the grave myself because no one came to help. I know what it is to be left standing in the wreckage of something and have the whole world decide you're finished. Her hand rose slow, deliberate, palm up, empty. I'm not leaving you in yours. Tempest's nose came down, hesitant, trembling, and touched Hannah's open palm. Nobody at that fence made a sound. Hannah stood there in the dust of that paddock with a killer horse breathing against her hand, and for the first time in 8 months, she felt something that wasn't grief and wasn't fear. It didn't have a name yet, but it was close enough to hope that her eyes filled without her permission, and she blinked hard and refused to let a single tear fall in front of these men. Behind her, she heard Luke let out a breath like he'd been holding it since she climbed the fence. Well, I'll be damned, one of the younger hands muttered. Silas said nothing at all. His arms were still crossed, his jaw still set, but something in his face had shifted. Not respect, not yet, but the first crack in a wall that had been solid a minute before. Hannah didn't turn around to see any of it. She kept her hand where it was, kept her voice low, and spoke only to the horse. There now, she whispered. See, nobody has to get hurt today. Tempest's ears flickered once more, uncertain and then, slow, wary, but real. She leaned the barest fraction of an inch closer, as if some small part of her had decided against every instinct that had kept her alive this past year that this particular human might be worth the risk. Luke climbed down off the fence rail without a word and stood watching his hat pushed back off his forehead, his rope still slung over one shoulder. Forgotten. Whatever he'd expected when he walked around that barn this morning, it hadn't been this. He looked at Hannah standing calm in the center of a paddock that had broken 2 of his best men, and something behind his eyes grief. Maybe old and carefully buried, stirred for the first time in longer than he could remember. Silas, he said, finally, not taking his eyes off Hannah. Get her a room in the bunkhouse annex, and tell Cook she's got help in the kitchen starting tonight. Boss, you can't be thinking of actually... I already am, Luke said. Hannah heard every word of it standing there with her hand still resting against the mare's velvet nose. And though she didn't turn around, though, she didn't smile. Something in her chest, something that had been clenched tight as a fist since the day she buried her husband, eased just slightly for the very first time. She had walked 7 miles that morning with nothing left to lose. She hadn't expected to find in the eyes of a wounded horse and a quiet, watching rancher the very first thread of something to hold on to again. Cook's name was Ruth Danvers, and she had exactly one reaction to being told she now had help in her kitchen. She set down the knife she'd been using to quarter potatoes, wiped her hands on her apron, and looked Hannah up and down like she was inspecting livestock at auction. You know how to keep a fire even, or are you gonna burn my biscuits black the first morning? I've fed a household of 6 on a wood stove older than I am, Hannah said. I know fire. We'll see. Ruth handed her the knife. Potatoes. Small dice. Boys don't like chewing rocks. Hannah took the knife and got to work, and for a while the only sound in the kitchen was the rhythm of blade against board, steady and quick, the kind of rhythm that came from years of practice and not a single wasted motion. Ruth watched her out of the corner of her eye for the better part of 10 minutes before she finally grunted, which Hannah was beginning to understand was about as close to approval as the woman gave out. "Silas is telling anyone who'll listen you charmed that horse with witchcraft," Ruth said. "Is that what he's calling it?" Man doesn't like being wrong, especially not in front of the whole outfit. Ruth cracked eggs into a bowl with brisk, economical movements. "You want my advice? Don't give him more reason to feel small. Man like that, you back him into a corner enough times he bites." "I didn't back him into anything. I just did what he said couldn't be done. Same thing far as men like Silas are concerned." Ruth glanced at her. "You really bury your husband yourself?" Hannah's knife didn't slow. "I did. That's a hard thing for a woman alone. Wasn't much choice in it." Ruth was quiet a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its brisk edge. "My sister lost her man to a rock slide up near the Bighorns. Took the county 3 days to send anybody out to help her, and by then she'd already dug the hole and said her words over him alone, same as you." She set the bowl down harder than it needed. "World doesn't wait around to be kind to widow women. You learn that quick or you don't survive it." "I learned it," Hannah said. That was the whole conversation. But something had shifted in the kitchen after it some invisible line crossed, and by the time the noon meal was ready to carry out to the men in the yard, Ruth was calling her Hannah instead of the new girl, which was, Hannah suspected, the closest thing to a welcome she was going to get from anybody at Mason Ridge except one man and one horse. The ranch hands ate standing up around the long table set outside the bunkhouse, and Hannah carried out the platters herself because Ruth's knees weren't what they used to be, and somebody had to do it. She felt the stairs the moment she stepped into the yard. Felt them settle on her like a physical weight, curious, skeptical, a few outright hostile. "That's her," she heard one man mutter to another. "The one that walked in the pen with Tempest. Heard she talked the devil right out of that horse. Heard she's touched in the head is what I heard." Hannah set the platter down without comment and turned to go back for the next one. A hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, not hard, but firm testing. "You really ain't scared of nothing, are you?" the man said. He was young, maybe her own age, with a crooked grin that suggested he thought this was charming. "Let go of my arm." "Just asking a question, ma'am, and I just gave you an answer." Hannah didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Something in the flatness of it made the young man's grin falter, and he released her wrist like it had gone suddenly hot. "No offense meant. None taken. Yet." She walked back toward the kitchen without looking back, and behind her, she heard someone else laugh, not at her this time, but at the young man who was rubbing his wrist like she'd branded him. "Tommy just got told," someone said, delighted. By the time Hannah reached the kitchen door, Luke Mason was standing in it, arms crossed, watching the whole scene with an expression she couldn't quite read. He stepped aside to let her pass, and she caught the faintest trace of a smile at the corner of his mouth before he schooled it away. "You didn't need to watch that," Hannah said. "Wasn't watching for your sake." Luke's eyes cut briefly toward Tommy, still nursing his wrist by the table. "Was watching to see if I needed to intervene. Looks like I didn't. You thought I couldn't handle one fresh cow hand. I thought Luke said that you handled a killer horse this morning without breaking a sweat. So no ma'am, I didn't figure Tommy Wade was gonna be much trouble." He paused. "Wanted to see it for myself anyhow." Hannah felt heat rise in her face that had nothing to do with the kitchen fire, and she turned back toward the stove before he could see it. "You planning on watching everything I do around here, Mr. Mason?" "Might be." His boots scraped against the threshold as he shifted his weight, and when he spoke again there was something almost hesitant in it, a roughness that hadn't been there a moment before. "Tempest let you touch her again before the noon bell. Silas told me. Said you sat outside her paddock near an hour, and she came right up to the fence on her own." "She did. Nobody's gotten her to do that. Not once. Not in 8 months. She's not broken, Mr. Mason. She was never broken. She was hurt, and everybody around her kept trying to fix that with force, and force was the very thing that hurt her in the first place. Hannah stirred the pot on the stove without looking at him. You can't force somebody to trust you. All you can do is prove patiently again and again that you won't hurt them. Eventually they believe it. The silence that followed had weight to it. When Hannah finally glanced up, Luke was looking at her with an expression that had nothing to do with horses at all, something quiet and searching, like he was turning her words over and finding they fit a much older wound than the one on Tempest's flank. "That's a fine philosophy," he said finally low. "It's not philosophy, it's just true." He held her gaze a second longer than was comfortable, and Hannah felt her pulse pick up in a way that startled her, a way she hadn't felt since long before her husband died, since before the marriage had gone the quiet, distant way it had gone in its last years. She looked away first. "I should get the rest of the platters out," she said. "Right." Luke didn't move for a moment. Then he cleared his throat and stepped back from the doorway. "Ruth says you make a decent stew." "Ruth's never eaten my stew." "She will tonight." He left before she could answer, and Hannah stood in the kitchen, a moment longer than necessary. One hand pressed flat against her chest, as if she could physically slow the traitorous thing hammering underneath her ribs. The days that followed fell into a rhythm, and Hannah welcomed the rhythm the way a drowning woman welcomes solid ground. Up before dawn to start the kitchen fire. Biscuits, eggs, bacon, coffee, thick enough to stand a spoon in, because Ruth said cowhands who didn't get proper coffee turned mean by 10 o'clock. Then the noon meal, then supper, then the hour, sometimes two, she spent sitting outside Tempest's paddock in the fading light, saying nothing most of the time, simply existing near the horse, until the horse stopped flinching at her presence. Silas watched all of it with the sour expression of a man waiting to be proven right. "She'll get bored," he told anyone who'd listen. "Women always do. Give it 2 weeks." 2 weeks came and went. Hannah was still there every evening, an apple or a bit of sugar in her palm, murmuring words too soft for anyone else to hear. Tempest's ears had stopped pinning flat at the sight of her. The mare had started in the last several days to actually walk toward the fence when Hannah approached, rather than waiting to be approached. It was Ruth who first noticed the ledgers. "You know sums?" she asked one evening, watching Hannah scribble figures into a small notebook by lamplight after the supper dishes were done. "I kept my husband's books for 6 years, and my father's before that." Hannah didn't look up from the column of numbers. "Your supply order from the mercantile in town, you're paying 2 cents over market for flour, and the sugar's marked up worse than that. Somebody's skimming, or the mercantile thinks nobody out here knows how to check a bill." Ruth's eyebrows shot up. "That mercantile's run by Harold Granger's cousin." Something in Hannah went very still. "Harold Granger? You know him." "I know the name." Hannah's jaw tightened, and for a moment the warmth went out of her face, entirely replaced by something colder. Older, a wound Ruth clearly hadn't meant to reopen. "He tried to buy my husband's land out from under me for 1/3 of its worth 6 weeks after the funeral. Told the bank I wasn't fit to hold a deed alone. Nearly succeeded, too, if I hadn't found the original survey papers proving the boundary lines he was disputing." Ruth set down her dish towel slowly. "That man's got his hands in half the county's business. Land cattle the bank itself, some folks say. You watch yourself around anything with the Granger name on it." "I intend to." Hannah didn't say more that night, but the name settled into her like a stone dropped into still water rings, spreading outward, long after the surface looked calm again. She hadn't expected to hear it here 4 counties from her old homestead. She should have known better. Men like Harold Granger didn't confine themselves to one small patch of misery when there was a whole territory to profit from. It was nearly 3 weeks in when the first real trouble came, and it came from the direction Hannah least expected. She was crossing the yard toward the paddock with an apple in her apron pocket when she heard raised voices coming from the barn. Luke's voice tight with a kind of controlled anger she hadn't heard from him before, and another voice, older, rougher one she didn't recognize. "Already told you the deal was 50 head at the price we agreed in March, not whatever inflated number you're trying to squeeze out of me now." "Prices change, Mason. Market's tighter than it was in March. Market's exactly the same as it was in March, and you know it. This is about something else. A pause heavy. This is about the fact that I turned down Granger's offer on the east pasture last month, isn't it? This is him trying to choke my supply lines because I wouldn't sell. Hannah stopped walking. She stood very still at the corner of the barn, out of sight, and listened. I don't know nothing about that, the rough voice said, though the way he said it made clear he knew plenty. I'm just telling you my price. Get off my land. Mason. Get off my land before I put you off it myself. Boots stomped past a moment later, a heavy-set man in a dusty coat, face red with anger, who didn't so much as glance at Hannah as he passed. She waited until he was gone before she rounded the corner of the barn and found Luke standing with both hands braced against a fence post, head down, breathing like a man trying to master his own temper. Everything all right? His head came up. For just a moment before he composed himself, she saw something raw in his face. Not anger exactly, but the exhaustion of a man fighting a battle on more fronts than anyone around him understood. Fine, he said. You don't look fine. Cattle brokers trying to squeeze me on a deal we already shook hands on. Luke straightened, scrubbed a hand down his face. It's nothing you need to worry yourself with. I heard Granger's name. Luke went still. I know that man, Mr. Mason. Better than I'd like to. Hannah kept her voice level, though something hot had settled behind her ribs at the mention of him. He tried to take my land from me after my husband died. Called it a fair offer. It wasn't. It was theft dressed up in legal paper, and it would have worked if I hadn't fought him in court for 11 months straight. Luke's eyes searched her face for a long moment. You fought Harold Granger in court, and won. I did. How? Records, Hannah said simply. He'd falsified a survey boundary to claim my north pasture ran onto land he already owned. I found the original county filing, 20 years old, buried in a courthouse archive nobody had looked at since it was filed. Showed the judge the discrepancy myself, line by line. A ghost of something fierce crossed her face. Men like Granger count on people not knowing how to read their own paperwork. I've always known how to read paperwork. Something shifted behind Luke's eyes. Not quite hope, but close to it. The particular light of a man who'd been carrying a weight alone, and just realized for the first time that he might not have to carry it alone anymore. He's been after my land for 2 years, Luke said slowly. East pasture backs up onto the rail spur they're planning to run through the territory next year. Whoever owns that land when the spur goes in stands to make a fortune leasing it to the railroad. Granger's offered 3 times what it's worth. I keep turning him down. He keeps finding new ways to make my life difficult for it. He exhaled hard. Cattle broker who just walked off my land was the 4th supplier this year to suddenly find his prices doubled where I'm concerned. He's trying to starve you out slow instead of buying you out fast. Seems that way? Let me see your account books, Hannah said. All of them. Every supplier, every deal, every price you've paid this year against what you paid last year. Luke frowned. Why? Because if he's squeezing you on every front, there'll be a pattern to it, and patterns can be proven. And because I know exactly how a man like Harold Granger structures paper to look legal while it robs you blind, and I've beaten him at that game once already. Hannah's chin lifted. Let me help. For a long moment, Luke simply looked at her, and Hannah felt the full weight of that look settle somewhere deep in her chest. Somewhere she'd thought had gone permanently cold the day she buried her husband. All right, he said quietly. Books are in the office. Tonight after supper. Warm. The ranch office was a small room off the main house, crowded with a roll-top desk buried under papers, a single lamp, and the particular musty smell of old ledgers that Hannah found strangely comforting. She sat across from Luke at the desk that evening with a stack of account books between them, and for 3 hours they worked in near silence, broken only by the scratch of her pencil and the occasional low exchange when she found something worth flagging. Here. She turned a ledger toward him, tapping a column of figures. Feed supplier out of Cheyenne. March you paid 11 cents a pound for grain. May same supplier, same grain, 14 cents. No explanation given. I remember that. Figured it was just the season. Grain prices don't jump 30% in 2 months without a reason, and there's no drought listed anywhere in the territory, reports that would explain it. Hannah flipped back several pages. Look here, your lumber supplier. Same pattern. Your hardware supplier out of the same pattern. Every single price increase happened within 2 weeks of Granger's last offer on your east pasture. Luke leaned back in his chair, jaw tight. He's got his fingers in every business that touches my ranch. He's got his fingers in the whole county from what Ruth tells me. Hannah closed the ledger. But paper trails work both ways, Mr. Mason. If he's coordinating these price increases, there'll be a connection between the suppliers themselves, shared ownership, shared family, shared debt. Find that connection, document it clean, and you've got proof of deliberate economic pressure, which is a very different thing in a courtroom than simple bad luck. You make it sound simple. It's not simple. It's just possible. She met his eyes. I spent 11 months proving what that man was capable of. I know exactly how deep his tricks run, and exactly how thin the ice is underneath them once somebody starts looking properly. Luke studied her for a long moment, something working behind his expression that he didn't immediately put into words. Can I ask you something, Mrs. Brooks? Hannah's fine. Hannah. The name sat differently in his mouth than Mrs. Brooks had softer somehow. Why do you care about my ranch, about this fight with Granger? You've been here 3 weeks. Man's given you a job and a room. You don't owe me a battle against Harold Granger on top of it. Hannah considered the question longer than it probably needed. Because when my husband died and Granger came sniffing around my land like a vulture that couldn't wait for the body to cool, there wasn't a single soul who stood beside me. My neighbors were too afraid of crossing him. The bank manager wouldn't even look me in the eye. I fought that whole fight completely alone. Mr. Mason and I won it, but it cost me something I'm not sure I've ever gotten back. Her voice dropped quieter now, rawer. I don't want to watch that happen to somebody else if I've got the knowledge to stop it. Luke didn't say anything for a long moment. Then quietly, Luke? What? You called me Mr. Mason. Name's Luke. Something in Hannah's chest loosened again, that same dangerous warmth from the kitchen doorway 3 weeks ago, and she found herself smiling despite everything, despite Granger, despite the grief still sitting in her like a stone, despite every reason she'd told herself over the last 8 months that she had no business feeling anything like this again. Luke, she repeated. There. A faint, answering smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Wasn't so hard, was it? They worked another hour after that, and something had changed in the room, some careful distance that had existed between them collapsing inch by inch with every ledger page they turned together. When Hannah finally rose to leave her back stiff from hours bent over the desk, Luke stood too quicker than necessary, as if some instinct in him wanted to close the space between them, and only barely stopped himself. Thank you, he said. For this. For all of it. We haven't found anything yet. Not proof enough to matter. We will. He said it with a conviction that surprised her, coming from a man who'd looked so weary standing at that fence post a few hours earlier. I believe that now. I didn't this morning, but I do now. Hannah left the office with her pulse still racing, and she told herself it was the numbers, the puzzle of the ledgers, the old familiar thrill of catching a man like Granger in his own trap. She told herself that all the way back to her room, and she almost believed it. The next real test came 4 days later, and it came in the form of Jacob Holt, the county's most experienced farrier, standing at the ranch gate with his tool bag in hand and deep reluctance written across every line of his face. Boss said the mare's ready, he told Silas, who'd come to meet him at the gate. I'll believe it when I see it. That horse took a chunk clean out of my forearm last spring. Still got the scar. She's ready, Hannah said, coming up beside them, and Jacob's eyes flicked toward her with open skepticism. You're the widow woman everybody's talking about. I'm the widow woman who spent 3 weeks earning that mare's trust 1 hour at a time. Yes. Jacob's mouth twisted, not quite a smile. Heard stories. Didn't believe half of them. Believe what you want. Just bring your tools and let her prove it herself. The whole ranch had gathered around the paddock by the time Hannah led Tempest out into the open pen where the shoeing would happen. Every hand, every stable boy. Ruth, wiping flour off her hands to come watch. Even Luke, standing at the fence rail with an expression that mixed hope and dread in equal measure. Silas stood at the far corner, arms crossed, waiting. Hannah suspected for exactly the kind of disaster that would prove him right after all. "You sure about this?" Luke asked quietly as Hannah settled Tempest with a hand along her neck. "No," Hannah admitted. "But she's sure. That's what matters." Jacob approached slowly, his tool bag set down a careful distance away, his eyes never leaving the mare's. Tempest's ears flicked back, the old fear rising visibly in the tension of her body, and for one terrible moment, Hannah thought it would all fall apart, right there in front of the whole ranch. "Easy," Hannah murmured low, just for the horse. "Easy now, you know me. You know I wouldn't bring anybody near you that meant you harm." Tempest's ears came forward just barely. Jacob crouched slowly at her front leg. "Talk to her while he works," Hannah told the small crowd without turning around. "Not loud, just steady. She spent her whole life around men who go quiet right before they hurt her. Show her that's not always true." Nobody moved for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, it was Silas who spoke first, gruff and awkward, clearly unused to talking to an animal like it might understand him. "Ain't gonna hurt you none, horse. Just gonna trim your feet up proper." Jacob lifted the first hoof. Tempest's whole body went rigid. A ripple of held breath ran through the crowd at the fence. Hannah kept one hand flat against the mare's neck, her voice steady, unbroken. "There she goes. There she goes. Good girl, that's it." The hoof stayed lifted. Jacob worked quick and careful, and 30 seconds later he set it back down gentle, and Tempest hadn't moved, hadn't kicked, hadn't so much as flinched beyond that first ripple of tension. A murmur went through the crowd, disbelief, low and awed. "Second one," Jacob said, voice tight with concentration, and moved to the next hoof. It took the better part of 40 minutes. 4 hooves each one. A small battle won through patience rather than force. Each one met with the same rigid tension, followed by the same slow release. By the time Jacob straightened up from the last hoof, wiping sweat from his brow, despite the cool evening air, the entire yard had gone dead silent. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, staring at his own hands like he couldn't quite believe what they'd just done. "She let me shoe all 4 without a single kick." The silence broke into something closer to disbelief. A few of the hands actually applauded, awkward and unpracticed, like they weren't sure the moment called for it, but couldn't help themselves. Ruth had both hands pressed over her mouth. Even Silas, standing in his corner with his arms still crossed, had gone very quiet, staring at the mare like he was seeing an entirely different animal than the one that had broken his men's bones for 8 months. Hannah pressed her forehead briefly against Tempest's neck, and for just a moment let herself feel the full weight of it. Not triumph exactly, but something close to it. A vindication that reached all the way back to a courthouse in another county, to a grave she'd dug alone, to every man who'd ever told her what she couldn't do. "Good girl," she whispered. Good girl." When she finally looked up, Luke was climbing over the fence, and he crossed the pen toward her, with a look on his face that made her breath catch. "You did that?" he said. "She did that. I just gave her the room to. Hannah." He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the exhaustion of the last 2 years, and the sudden cautious light breaking through it now. "In 8 months, I'd nearly convinced myself she'd have to be put down. I couldn't bring myself to do it, but I'd started thinking it was the only mercy left." His voice roughened. "You gave me back the finest horse I've ever owned. You gave her back her whole future. She gave it back to herself. I just stopped getting in the way." Silas approached slowly from his corner hat in his hands now, instead of crossed arms, and stopped a few feet off, clearly working up to something. "Ma'am," he said finally. "Miss Brooks, I owe you an apology, I reckon. Told you a killer horse would put you in the ground before the week was out. Told everybody who'd listen." He shifted his weight jaw working. "Never seen anything like what I just watched. Don't rightly know what to make of it except that I was wrong and there ain't no use pretending otherwise." Hannah studied him a moment. There was no performance in his face, no lingering mockery, just the plain, uncomfortable honesty of a proud man admitting fault in front of everyone who worked under him. "Apology accepted, Mr. Boone. Silas is fine." Silas. She almost smiled. Fear doesn't disappear because someone's stronger than it, Silas. Only disappears when someone finally listens to what's causing it. Same's true for horses as it is for people. Silas's throat worked. He nodded once sharp and turned away before anyone could see whatever was working behind his weathered face. And Hannah let him go without comment, understanding better than most exactly what it cost a man like that to be wrong out loud. That night, after the excitement had settled and the ranch had gone quiet under a wide spray of stars, Hannah found herself back at the paddock fence, watching Tempest graze easy and unbothered in the moonlight, newly shod feet moving without a trace of the old rigid fear. She didn't hear Luke approach until he was leaning on the fence beside her. "Couldn't sleep either," he said. "Too much to think about." "Good thoughts, I hope." "Mostly." Hannah kept her eyes on the horse. "I keep thinking about Granger. About what he'll do when he hears his squeeze on your suppliers isn't working, that you're not desperate enough yet to sell. Let him try something else. We'll be ready." Luke's shoulder brushed hers on the fence rail, close, deliberate, in a way that made her pulse stumble. "Been a long time since I had somebody to say we about Hannah." She turned to look at him and found him already watching her, moonlight catching the tired hope in his face. "How long since your wife?" she asked quietly. She hadn't meant to ask it so directly, but something about the night, the stars, the exhaustion of a long, good day made the question slip out before she could soften it. Luke's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. 3 years. Fever same as your husband. Different fever, same cruelty to it." He exhaled slow. "I threw myself into this ranch after. Told myself the work was enough. Told myself I didn't need anything else." "Did you believe that? Some days?" A ghost of a smile. "Fewer days lately." The air between them had gone very still, charged with something neither of them had said outright, and Hannah felt the pull of it low in her chest, dangerous and warm and entirely unwelcome, given everything else she was carrying. "Luke, I know." He straightened, put a careful step of distance back between them, though his eyes stayed on her a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Too soon. For both of us, probably. I'm not asking for anything, Hannah. Just glad you're here. Glad Tempest let you in. Glad this ranch has you in it." "I'm glad too," she admitted, and meant it more than she'd expected to. He tipped his hat to her, the old courtesy of it oddly formal, given the moment that had just passed between them, and turned to walk back toward the house. Hannah watched him go, one hand pressed to the fence rail, and turned back to find Tempest watching her with dark, steady eyes, as if the horse understood exactly what had just happened and approved of it entirely. "Don't look at me like that," Hannah murmured, and the mare huffed out a breath that sounded absurdly like laughter. "Observateur." The peace didn't last a week. It was Ruth who brought the news, hurrying into the kitchen with a folded newspaper clutched in one hand and an expression that told Hannah before a single word was said that something had gone badly wrong. "You need to see this." Hannah wiped her hands on her apron and took the paper. The Cheyenne County Gazette, 3 days old, folded open to a section near the back that dealt in local gossip and society notices. Her stomach dropped before she'd even finished reading the headline. "Widow's intentions toward prosperous rancher questioned sources, suggest calculated design." She read it twice, her hands going cold, despite the warmth of the kitchen. The piece was carefully worded, careful enough to avoid outright libel, but the implication crawled through every line like something rotten that Hannah Brooks, recently widowed and conveniently landless, had targeted Luke Mason specifically for his prosperity, that her sudden skill with a dangerous horse was suspiciously convenient, that a woman with her history of aggressive legal maneuvering against Harold Granger, a respected local businessman, ought to raise questions about her true motives on the Mason ranch. "They're calling me a fortune hunter," Hannah said very quietly. "It's Granger," Ruth said, furious. Has to be. Nobody else would twist it this way, and nobody else stands to gain from Luke losing his good name over it. Hannah set the paper down on the counter with hands that weren't quite steady. 8 months of grief, of fighting alone, of proving herself over and over to men who assumed the worst. And here it was again, dressed up in newsprint instead of a foreman's sneer, but cutting just as deep. Does Luke know? Not yet. Just came from town myself. Hannah closed her eyes for one long moment, gathering herself, and when she opened them again, there was something hard and resolved in her expression that hadn't been there a minute before. Then I'd better be the one to tell him, she said, before somebody else does it for me and makes it worse. She found him in the barn, checking a mare's foreleg for a supplier who was due to collect her that afternoon, and the moment he looked up and saw her face, he straightened immediately, all business dropping away. What happened? Hannah handed him the paper without a word. She watched his face as he read it, watched the color rise in his cheeks, watched his jaw go tight enough to ache. This is filth, he said, low and furious. This is absolute filth, and everybody in the county with sense enough to think will see straight through it. Not everybody has sense enough to think Luke. That's exactly what men like Granger count on. He looked up at her, and something in his expression shifted from anger to something gentler, protective. You didn't do anything wrong. Who doesn't matter. It never has not with men like him. He couldn't beat me honestly in a courtroom 4 years ago, so he tried to beat me dishonestly instead, and lost that too. Now he can't buy your land honestly, so he's trying to poison your good name through mine. Hannah's voice shook just slightly, the only outward sign of how deep the wound went. I know exactly how this game is played, Luke. It doesn't get easier to stomach just because I've played it before. Luke folded the paper carefully, deliberately, like he was folding away his own anger to make room for something steadier. I'm not letting this stand. You can't fight a newspaper piece with a fist fight. Wasn't planning to. He set the paper down on a nearby crate. I'm planning to fight it the way you taught me to fight Granger in the first place. With proof, with paper, with the truth laid out so plain nobody can twist it anymore. Something in Hannah's chest cracked open at that. Not from pain this time, but from the sheer relief of being believed defended, stood beside instead of judged from a distance. There's someone in town, she said slowly. Margaret Ellison. Ruth mentioned her runs the social committee, has half the county's respectable opinion in her pocket. If she believes the worst of me, it'll spread through every parlor and church social from here to the county line before the week's out. Then we'll make sure she hears the truth before the lie finishes spreading. She won't want to hear it from me, not yet. Women like her decide who's respectable long before they bother asking questions. Luke's jaw set in a way Hannah was coming to recognize the look of a man who'd made up his mind and wasn't inclined to unmake it. Then she'll hear it from me, and from Silas, and from every hand on this ranch who watched you tame that mare with nothing but patience and kindness. Let her measure that against a rumor with no name attached to it. Hannah looked at him for a long moment and felt underneath the fear and the old familiar ache of being doubted again something steadier, taking root, the strange, dangerous comfort of not standing entirely alone in the fight this time. Thank you, she said quietly. Don't thank me yet. Luke's eyes had gone hard again, fixed on some middle distance that wasn't the barn at all. Because if this is Granger's opening move, it isn't going to be his last, and whatever he tries next is going to be worse. Outside, the afternoon light had begun to shift toward evening, gold turning to amber across the yard, and somewhere beyond the barn, Tempest let out a low, restless whinny, as if some part of the horse could sense the trouble gathering on the wind, long before either of them said it out loud. Margaret Ellison's parlor smelled of lavender water and old money, and she received them the way she received everyone she considered beneath immediate suspicion, with a smile stretched thin over judgment, already half decided. Mr. Mason. She extended a hand, cool and brief. And this must be Mrs. Brooks. I've heard so much. I imagine you have, Hannah said evenly. Margaret's eyes flicked over her, cataloging the plain dress, the work-roughened hands, the absence of any jewelry beyond a thin wedding band, worn on a chain around her neck instead of her finger. Do sit. I have tea. They didn't sit long before Margaret set her cup down with a precise little click and folded her hands in her lap, the posture of a woman about to deliver an opinion she considered a kindness. "I'll speak plainly, since I understand plain speaking is rather your style, Mrs. Brooks. The county has taken note of your rather remarkable rise at Mason Ridge. Cooked a horse whisperer, too, from what I hear, regular company in Mr. Mason's private office of an evening." Her eyebrow arched delicately. "Some might call that ambition. Others might call it something less flattering." "Others being Harold Granger," Luke said before Hannah could answer. Margaret's composure flickered just barely. "Mr. Granger has been a generous supporter of this county for many years." "Mr. Granger tried to steal my land 4 years ago with a falsified survey," Hannah said. "I have the court records, Mrs. Ellison, if you'd like to review them yourself, rather than take my word for it. Or his." "That's a very serious accusation." "It's a very well-documented fact. I won the case. It's a matter of public record in the courthouse, should you care to check." Hannah kept her voice level, though her pulse hammered. "I understand you have influence in this county, ma'am. I understand that word from you carries weight in every parlor from here to the church steps. I'm not asking you to like me. I'm asking you to withhold judgment until you've seen the truth instead of the rumor." Margaret studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment. Something in Hannah's directness seemed to catch her off guard. She'd clearly expected pleading or anger, not calm evidence offered plainly across a tea tray. "The Gazette piece was unsigned," Margaret said slowly. "I confess I found that curious myself." "Everything Granger touches is unsigned," Luke said. "That's how he's operated for years. Never his name on the paper, always somebody else's hand doing the writing. That's a serious thing to say about a man of his standing." "It's a serious thing he's been doing for longer than you'd like to believe," Hannah said. "Ask around Mrs. Ellison. Ask the cattle brokers who've suddenly doubled their prices to Mason Ridge this year. Ask the mercantile why their flour costs 2 cents over market for anyone buying on Luke Mason's account. There's a pattern underneath the gossip, if anyone bothers to look for it, instead of simply repeating what's whispered." Margaret was quiet a long moment, her tea going cold in front of her. When she finally spoke, some of the starch had gone out of her voice. "I don't relish being made a fool of, Mrs. Brooks." "Neither do I. Which is precisely why I'm sitting in your parlor instead of ignoring the Gazette and hoping it goes away." That, more than anything else said in that room, seemed to land. Margaret's chin lifted a fraction, some private calculation working behind her eyes. "I'll withhold my opinion," she said finally. "For now, but I'll be watching Mrs. Brooks closely. That's all I ask." They didn't get 3 days of quiet before the next blow landed. It came at dusk when Silas rode in hard from the eastern boundary with his horse lathered and his face grim in a way that made Hannah's stomach drop before he'd said a single word. "Boss, you need to see the east fence line." Luke was already moving toward his own horse. "What happened?" "Somebody cut it. 1/4 mile of fence cut clean through in 6 places. 40 head scattered into the breaks before I even found the gap." Silas's jaw worked. "And there's this." He held out a folded scrap of paper, and Luke read it with a face going progressively harder, then handed it to Hannah without a word. "Sell now. Save yourself the trouble of losing it piece by piece. No signature. There never was." "He's escalating," Hannah said quietly. "He's desperate," Luke corrected. Though his voice shook with a fury he was visibly working to control. "The rail spur survey's coming through in 6 weeks. If I still own that east pasture when the surveyors arrive, he loses his chance at it entirely. Somebody else will lease it to the railroad instead, and it won't be him. Then we have 6 weeks to prove what he's doing before he does something worse than cutting fence." Luke looked at her, something grim and resolved settling into his features. "I'm riding out at first light to gather the herd. Silas, get every hand you can spare." "I'm coming," Hannah said. "Hannah, I know cattle, Luke. I grew up on a ranch same as you did. And somebody needs to document every piece of this, every cut fence, every scattered head, every dollar it costs to fix, because that's evidence, and evidence is the only weapon that's ever worked against a man like Granger." Her jaw set. "I'm not staying in the kitchen while your ranch bleeds out around you," He held her gaze a long moment, and whatever he saw there, the same stubborn resolve that had walked her into a killer horse's paddock a month before, made him nod short and final. First light, then. The gather took 2 brutal days. Hannah rode alongside the hands in a borrowed pair of trousers under her skirt hair, braided back tight, and if any of the men still harbored doubts about her competence, those doubts died somewhere in the first 6 hours of hard riding across broken country, chasing scattered cattle out of ravines and brush thickets under a punishing sun. By the second evening, they'd recovered 36 of the 40 head. 4 were gone for good, driven Silas suspected deliberately toward a box canyon, where wolves had gotten to 2 of them before anyone found the carcasses. "That's not carelessness," Silas said, crouched over what was left of one steer, his face carved from stone. "Somebody drove these animals here on purpose. Can you prove it?" Tracks head straight back toward the county road. Shod horses, 3 of them moving with purpose, not strays wandering loose. Silas straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers. "I'd stake my life it's men on Granger's payroll. Can't prove whose orders they were following, though. Man's too careful for that." Hannah crouched down beside the tracks herself, studying them with the same patient attention she'd once given a frightened horse. "Not too careful," she said slowly. "Just careful enough that nobody's bothered to look closely before now." She sketched the tracks into her notebook, the same notebook she'd used to catalog the price discrepancies in Luke's ledgers, and something in the methodical certainty of the gesture seemed to steady Silas as much as it steadied her. "You always this thorough?" he asked. "I learned the hard way that thoroughness is the only thing that beats a man who lies for a living." She closed the notebook. "Granger's not invincible, Silas. He's just never been documented properly. That's about to change." They rode back into the ranch yard on the 3rd evening to find Ruth waiting at the gate, her face tight with a different kind of trouble entirely. "Man came by from town," she said before Luke had even swung down from his horse. "Sheriff's deputy. Left this." She handed over a folded notice, and Hannah watched Luke's face drain of color as he read it. "What is it?" she asked. "Lion notice." His voice came out flat, stunned. "Somebody's filed a lien against the ranch. Claims I owe $1,100 on a feed contract I never signed." He looked up, and the exhaustion in his face had turned to something closer to fear. "If I can't prove I never signed it within 30 days, the county can force a sale to satisfy the debt." "Let me see it." He handed it over, and Hannah scanned the document with the swift, practiced eye of a woman who'd spent 11 months learning to read exactly this kind of trap. Her stomach turned cold. "This signature's forged," she said. "Look at the loop on the M in Mason, compare it to your actual signature on the deed papers in the office. It's close, but it's not right. Whoever forged this either never saw your real signature closely or got sloppy in a hurry. Can you prove that in front of a judge?" "I can prove it well enough to raise serious doubt. But Luke—" She looked up at him, and something urgent had crept into her voice. "This isn't just an attack on your money anymore. Filing a false lien is fraud. Actual prosecutable fraud if we can trace it back to whoever filed it. This might be the mistake that finally gives us something solid enough to end this. How do we trace it? County clerk's office keeps a record of every document filed and who filed it in person. Somebody walked this notice into that office. Somebody signed a filing log with their own name, not a forgery, because the clerk requires it." Hannah's mind was already racing ahead, the old thrill of the hunt rising in her, despite the exhaustion of 3 days in the saddle. "If we can get a look at that filing log before Granger thinks to have it altered, you think he'd go that far? Bribing a county clerk? I think a man who forges signatures and cuts fence lines and pays men to drive cattle into wolf country isn't above bribing a clerk," Hannah said grimly. "We need to move fast, tomorrow, before he realizes we're looking." The county clerk, a nervous, balding man named Otis Pruitt, went pale the moment Luke and Hannah walked into his office the following morning and asked to see the filing log for the previous week. That's not typically something I show to." "It's a public record, Mr. Pruitt," Hannah said pleasantly, though there was steel underneath the pleasantness. "I checked the county statute myself before we rode in this morning. Filing logs are public record available to any citizen who requests to view them. I'd hate to have to mention to the county judge that a request was refused." Otis's throat worked visibly. His eyes darted toward the door, then back to Hannah, then to Luke, and something in his nervous cornered posture told Hannah everything she needed to know before he'd said a single further word. "He paid you," she said quietly. "Didn't he?" "I don't know what you're—" "Mr. Pruitt." Luke's voice had gone very low, very dangerous. "I've known you 8 years. Bought your boy his first pony. I'd hate to think you'd let Harold Granger buy something in you that can't be sold back." Otis's composure cracked entirely. He sank into his chair, hands trembling. "He said it was nothing. Said the lien was legitimate, just needed processing quiet and quick, no questions asked. Said there'd be $50 in it for me if I didn't make a fuss." His voice dropped to a miserable whisper. "I've got 4 kids, Mr. Mason. Clerk's salary don't stretch far. Show us the actual filing," Hannah said gently, now sensing the man's guilt might be turned to their advantage if handled right. "The real one, not what's in the public log. Show us who actually walked that lien notice into this office." Otis hesitated one long, agonized moment. Then he pulled a separate ledger from the bottom drawer of his desk, a private record, the kind a guilty man kept to protect himself if things ever went badly wrong. "I kept my own notes," he admitted. In case it ever came to this." He turned the ledger around. "Man who filed it called himself Wade Coulter. Works for Granger direct foreman on his home spread. I recognized him. Everybody in town knows Coulter's face." Hannah felt something settle into place in her chest, cold and certain. "That's enough of a thread to pull Luke." "Will you testify to this, Otis?" Luke asked. "In front of a judge if it comes to that." Otis's face went gray. "Granger'll ruin me. Granger's already ruining this whole county one quiet lie at a time," Hannah said. "The only way that stops is if somebody finally tells the truth loud enough that it can't be bought back into silence." She leaned forward. "You have a chance right now to be the man who finally did that, Mr. Pruitt. Or you can keep taking his $50 and hope nobody ever asks you straight to your face the way we just did." The silence stretched long and heavy. Finally, Otis nodded, small and miserable, but a nod all the same. "I'll testify," he said. "God help me, I will." The pieces came together faster after that, the way a dam breaks all at once, after weeks of quiet pressure building behind it. Coulter's name, once known, opened doors that had stayed shut before a bank teller willing to confirm quietly that Granger's accounts showed regular withdrawals matching the exact amounts of the supplier's sudden price hikes against Mason Ridge. A stable hand at Granger's own ranch, resentful over unpaid wages, willing to confirm he'd overheard Coulter bragging about the fence-cutting job and getting well paid for it. Hannah worked late into every night compiling it, cross-referencing dates, building the same kind of airtight paper case she'd once built to save her own land, except this time she wasn't building it alone. "You should sleep," Luke told her one night, finding her still bent over the desk, past midnight lamp burning low. "Can't. Not until this is finished." She rubbed her eyes, but didn't stop writing. "I keep thinking about what happens if we're wrong, if the judge doesn't see it the way we see it. You won your own case. I won it because the evidence was undeniable, laid out so plainly a child could follow it. This has to be the same. No gaps, no assumptions, nothing. Granger's lawyer can twist into reasonable doubt." She finally set the pen down, exhaustion catching up to her all at once. "I've seen how quickly the truth can lose to a clever lie in front of the wrong judge, Luke. I won't let that happen to you." He crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands gently in his, the first time he touched her with real deliberate intention, rather than the accidental brush of shoulders at a fence rail. "Hannah, whatever happens in that courtroom, I need you to hear this now, because I don't know when I'll have the courage to say it again." His voice had gone rough, unsteady. "You walked onto this ranch a stranger with nothing but a carpet bag, and more courage than any person I've ever met. You tamed a horse everybody else had given up on. You've fought a war against a man twice as powerful as either of us, and you've done it without once asking for anything in return except the chance to help." His thumb moved gently over her knuckles. "I don't know how to be a man who deserves that kind of loyalty, but I know I don't want to face whatever's coming without you standing beside me." Hannah's eyes burned, and for once she let the tears come, didn't blink them back the way she had that first morning in Tempest's paddock. "I buried a man I loved 8 months ago, Luke. I told myself I wasn't ready for anything like this again, that I might never be. And now I think grief taught me something I didn't expect it to teach me, that being ready isn't a thing you wait for. It's a thing you choose, the same way I chose to walk into that paddock not knowing whether that horse would kill me." Her hand tightened around his. "I'm choosing this, choosing you. I just need you to know whatever happens with Granger, whatever it costs, I'm not walking away from this fight, and I'm not walking away from you." He kissed her, then slow and careful, like he was afraid she might vanish if he moved too fast, and Hannah felt 8 months of grief and fear and grim, lonely determination finally loosen its grip on her chest, just slightly, just enough to breathe. The hearing was set for the following Thursday at the county courthouse, and word had spread through the territory fast enough that the small courtroom was packed to standing room by the time the judge called the proceedings to order. Hannah sat beside Luke at the front, her hands folded tight in her lap, and felt every eye in the room settle on her, some curious, some still hostile, a few surprisingly sympathetic. Margaret Ellison sat 3 rows back, her spine rigid, her expression unreadable. Harold Granger sat at the opposing table, with his lawyer composed almost bored, the picture of a man who'd never once in his life expected consequences to catch up to him. "Mr. Mason," the judge said, an older man with tired eyes and a reputation Hannah had learned for having little patience for nonsense in his courtroom. "You've brought a serious accusation against a prominent member of this county. I trust you understand the weight of what you're alleging." "I do, Your Honor." "Then let's hear it. Plainly and with evidence, or not at all." Luke rose, and Hannah watched him steady himself with a breath. Before he began, not with anger, but with the same calm, measured directness she'd taught him over weeks of ledgers and quiet evening conversations. "Your Honor, over the past 2 months, my ranch has suffered a coordinated pattern of sabotage and fraud, beginning shortly after I declined Mr. Granger's repeated offers to purchase my east pasture." He laid out the timeline, the sudden price increases across every supplier, the cut fence line, the scattered and slaughtered cattle, the forged lien notice. Granger's lawyer objected repeatedly, each time with less conviction, as Luke methodically produced documentation for every claim, the ledgers Hannah had cross-referenced by lamplight, the tracking sketches from the Box Canyon, Otis Pruitt's private filing record. "Objection, Your Honor. This is circumstantial at best." "Your Honor," Hannah said, rising before she'd fully decided, to her voice cutting cleanly across the courtroom. "If I may, I have direct experience with Mr. Granger's methods that speaks to a pattern of behavior stretching back years, not weeks." The judge studied her a long moment. "And you are Hannah Brooks, Your Honor." 4 years ago, Harold Granger attempted to seize my late husband's ranch through a falsified survey boundary. I successfully contested that fraud in Sweetwater County Court, with documentation available for this court's review. She held up a bound copy of the original case file prepared days in advance for exactly this moment. The method used against Mr. Mason mirrors almost precisely the method used against me. Quiet economic pressure, followed by fraudulent paper filed to force a sale under duress, executed always through intermediaries, so Mr. Granger's own name never appears directly on the fraud. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Granger's composed expression flickered just slightly for the first time. "That's outrageous speculation," his lawyer snapped. "My client is a respected businessman." "Then let Wade Coulter explain under oath why the county clerk's private filing record shows his name attached to the fraudulent lien notice against Mr. Mason's property," Hannah said, and the courtroom went utterly silent. The judge's eyebrows rose. "You have this individual present." "He's been subpoenaed, Your Honor," Luke said, "along with Mr. Otis Pruitt, the county clerk who can testify to receiving payment to process the fraudulent filing without proper review. Granger's face had gone pale beneath its weathered tan. His lawyer leaned over to whisper something urgent in his ear, and for the first time since the hearing began, the man who'd terrorized 2 ranches and half a county looked unmistakably afraid. Otis Pruitt took the stand. First hands, shaking voice barely audible, but he told the truth, every uncomfortable word of it, the $50 Coulter's name in his private ledger, the instruction to process the fraud quiet and quick. Then came Silas called to testify to the fence cutting and the tracks leading back toward the county road, his gruff testimony carrying an unexpected weight precisely because everyone in that courtroom who knew him understood he wasn't a man given to exaggeration. Then, unexpectedly, a stable hand from Granger's own ranch thin, nervous, clearly terrified of his employer's presence just 20 feet away, confirmed under oath that he'd heard Coulter boasting about being paid to drive cattle toward the wolves in the Box Canyon, and paid extra to keep quiet about it after. By the time the final witness stepped down, the courtroom had gone from murmuring disbelief to something closer to outrage, and Harold Granger sat rigid at his table, his composure entirely abandoned, his lawyer whispering increasingly frantic counsel that Granger no longer seemed to be hearing at all. The judge removed his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose, the universal gesture of a man who'd heard more than enough. "Mr. Granger." His voice had gone hard final. "This court has heard sufficient testimony and documentary evidence to establish a clear and troubling pattern of fraud, intimidation, and destruction of property carried out on your behalf, whether or not your own hand ever touched the instruments used. I am ordering an immediate investigation into your business dealings across this entire county effective today, with full subpoena power granted to the county prosecutor's office." The courtroom erupted into noise. Hannah barely heard it over the pounding of her own heart, and she felt Luke's hand close tight around hers under the table, both of them holding on like the ground itself might tilt beneath them. "Furthermore," the judge continued, raising his voice over the din, "the lien against Mason Ridge Ranch is hereby declared null and fraudulent and struck from county record effective immediately. Mr. Mason, you are free to proceed with your operation without further encumbrance from this filing." Granger rose from his table, face a mottled, furious red, and for one terrible moment, Hannah thought he might actually cross the courtroom toward them. His lawyer caught his arm, hissing something urgent, and Granger's eyes swept the room, landing finally venomously on Hannah herself. "This isn't finished," he said low, meant only for her, though half the courtroom heard it anyway. "It is for you," Hannah said, standing to meet his gaze without flinching, the same way she'd stood without flinching in front of a charging horse a month before. "Every trick you've used twice now has failed against the same thing. The truth laid out plain enough that even a courtroom full of strangers couldn't be fooled by your lies. You should have learned that the first time, Mr. Granger. Some of us don't stay quiet, and some of us don't stay buried." The bailiff moved to escort Granger from the courtroom, his lawyer trailing behind him, already talking in low, urgent tones about appeals and damage control, and the crowd parted around him with none of the deference he'd once commanded, only cold watching silence. Margaret Ellison rose from her seat 3 rows back and crossed the courtroom floor directly to where Hannah still stood trembling, now that the adrenaline had begun to ebb. "I owe you an apology, Mrs. Brooks," Margaret said, quiet enough that only Hannah and Luke could hear. "I judged you on rumor before I bothered to learn the truth. That was beneath me, and I know it." "You came to hear the truth today instead of hiding from it," Hannah said. "That's more than most people manage." Margaret's composure cracked just slightly, something almost human breaking through the polished surface. "I misjudged a woman I never truly took the time to know. I won't make that mistake again." She turned and walked out, and the crowd that had once whispered behind Hannah's back now parted for her with something closer to respect, murmurs of admiration, following in Margaret's wake, instead of the old suspicion. Luke turned to Hannah in the emptying courtroom, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all, simply stood there in the fading afternoon light, slanting through the tall windows, holding onto each other's hands, like anchors, like proof that everything they'd fought for over the past 2 months had finally impossibly come to rest. "It's over," Luke said, wonder plain in his voice. "Wonder. The lien is," Hannah said. "The investigation's only just beginning. There'll be more to face before this is truly finished." "Then we'll face it," Luke said, "the same way we faced all of it. Together." Outside the courthouse, the whole territory seemed to know already, word traveling faster than either of them could have anticipated, ranch hands and shopkeepers and strangers alike stopping to nod at Luke, to look at Hannah with something that had shifted undeniably from suspicion into something closer to awe. Somewhere behind them, back at Mason Ridge, Tempest waited in the golden light of late afternoon, newly shod feet steady beneath her, a horse nobody had believed could be saved. Standing now as living proof of exactly what patience and truth could accomplish against every voice that had once called it impossible. The investigation into Harold Granger's affairs moved faster than anyone at Mason Ridge expected, and slower than Hannah's nerves could comfortably bear. Word came by rider 3 days after the hearing that the county prosecutor had frozen Granger's accounts pending review, and 2 days after that a second rancher, a widower named Chester Voss, out past the northern range, had come forward with his own story of sabotaged fence lines and mysteriously doubled supplier prices, filed away for years out of fear, and finally spoken aloud once he heard what had happened in that courtroom. "He's not the only one," Ruth said, setting a plate of biscuits down in front of Hannah with more force than necessary, her face flushed with something between anger and vindication. "Woman came through the mercantile yesterday, said her brother lost 40 acres to Granger 3 years back over a boundary dispute that sounds exactly like what he tried on you. Didn't have the money to fight it in court, just took the loss and moved on." "How many more do you think there are?" "However many there are, they're finding their voice now," Ruth said. "That's what you did, you know. Not just for Luke. You cracked something open in this whole county that's been sealed shut a long time." Hannah didn't answer right away. She sat with her coffee going cold in front of her, thinking of all the people who'd suffered quietly under Granger's schemes, without the resources or the courage to fight back, and felt the old grief and the new hope tangle together in her chest, until she couldn't tell one from the other. "It doesn't feel like winning," she admitted. "Not yet. Feels like we've only just started pulling the thread." "Sometimes that's what winning looks like at first," Ruth said. "Messy, slow. Feels more like work than victory." Luke found her later that morning, out by Tempest's paddock, notebook in hand, cataloging the mare's gait as she moved easy and sound across the pen, a habit Hannah had kept up daily since the shoeing wanting proof on paper that the horse's recovery was holding. "Got a letter," Luke said, and something in his voice made her look up sharp. "From who?" "Prosecutor's office." He held it out and Hannah took it, scanning quickly. Her stomach dropped somewhere around the third line. "They want you to testify again. Formally this time, not just at a local hearing. Territory-level inquiry." She looked up at him. "Luke, this is bigger than the lien case now. If they're calling a territorial inquiry, they're building toward criminal charges, not just civil penalties." "I know." His jaw was tight. "Prosecutor wants everyone who testified before to give sworn depositions. Otis, Silas, the stable hand, you." "When?" 2 weeks, Cheyenne." Hannah closed the notebook slowly, her mind already racing ahead, through everything that meant a longer fight, a bigger stage. A man like Granger, with nothing left to lose, and every reason to strike back harder before it was too late. "He's not going to sit quiet for 2 weeks while this builds against him," she said. "No," Luke agreed. "He's not." He was right, and it took less than 4 days to prove it. God. The fire started sometime after midnight, and it was Silas who woke the ranch, pounding on doors and shouting, until every hand tumbled out into the yard half-dressed and stumbling with sleep, the eastern sky lit up orange where it should have been black. "Hey, barn," Silas bellowed. "Get the buckets, get the wagon, move." Hannah was out of her room and running before she'd fully processed what she was seeing. Flames already climbing high through the old barn's roof embers, spiraling up into the night sky, the terrible dry crackle of a summer's worth of hay going up all at once. Luke was already at the well, hauling buckets with a speed that spoke of pure animal panic held barely in check. "The horses," Hannah shouted. "Is Tempest?" "Different paddock, she's clear." Luke's voice was raw, already hoarse from smoke. "It's just feed and equipment in that barn. Nobody's stock is inside, thank God." They fought the fire for 2 hours, a chain of buckets and wet sacking, and sheer desperate effort. And by the time the flames finally guttered down to smoldering ash, half the winter's hay supply was gone, and the old barn was nothing but a blackened skeleton against the dawn light. Hannah stood in the wreckage afterwards, soot-streaked and exhausted, staring at what remained, and felt a cold certainty settle into her that had nothing to do with accident. "Silas." Her voice came out hoarse from smoke. "Was anyone near that barn tonight? Any reason for a fire to start on its own?" Silas was already crouched at the barn's far corner, examining something in the ash with a grim expression. "No reason," he said. "No lamp kept out there, no stove. Nothing that starts a fire on its own past midnight in the middle of summer." He held up a scorched fragment of glass, unmistakably the shattered remains of a lantern that had never belonged in that barn to begin with. "Somebody threw this, broke it against the hay on purpose." The rage that moved through Hannah then was quieter than fear, colder and far more dangerous. "He's trying to bankrupt you before the inquiry even happens," she said. "Burn your feed supply in the middle of summer and you're forced to buy replacement hay at whatever price the market demands, right when your accounts are already frozen from the fallout of the lean fight." "It's working," Luke admitted grimly, surveying the damage. "I don't have the capital to replace this fast enough. Winter's coming, whether Granger's in jail by then or not, and cattle don't wait on a court's timeline to need feeding. Then we find another way." Hannah's mind was already turning the same restless problem-solving instinct that had once cracked open Granger's fraud, now bending itself toward this fresh crisis. Chester Voss, the rancher who came forward after the hearing, Ruth said he lost land to Granger too. If he's got hay to spare, and a reason to want Granger stopped as much as we do. You think a stranger's going to extend credit to a man he's never met based on nothing but shared trouble? "I think shared trouble builds trust faster than almost anything else does," Hannah said. "I'd know." Chester Voss turned out to be a weathered, quiet man in his 50s who listened to their proposal with his hat in his hands and a suspicious, careful expression that softened only slightly, as Hannah laid out the full extent of what Granger had done to both their properties. "Heard about the fire," he said finally. "Word travels fast when it's this kind of trouble." He was quiet a long moment, studying Luke's face, then Hannah's, weighing something private behind his tired eyes. "I got hay to spare. More than I need for my own stock this winter, if I'm honest. Was planning to sell the surplus at market rate to whoever'd pay for it." "We can't match market rate right now," Luke admitted. "Not with my accounts frozen pending the inquiry. Didn't ask you to." Chester's mouth twitched something almost like a smile. "Man tried to steal 40 acres from my family with a fraud so similar to what he tried on you and Mrs. Brooks here. It's like he's got a single trick and never bothered learning a second one. I'll extend you the hay on credit, Mr. Mason, same terms as if you were paying cash. Settle up once your accounts thaw out, whenever that is." "Mr. Voss, I can't ask you to take that risk." "You didn't ask. I'm offering." Chester's jaw set something hard and resolved behind the offer. Man like Granger's been getting away with this kind of thing for years because nobody had the proof or the courage to stand against him at once. You two change that. Least I can do is make sure his last desperate swing doesn't take you down before the law finally catches up to him. Hannah felt something warm crack open in her chest, watching two strangers, men who'd never have crossed paths if not for a shared enemy, shake hands over a debt built entirely on trust instead of collateral. It reminded her sharply and unexpectedly of Ruth's kitchen weeks ago, of Silas's stiff apology in the dust of the paddock, of every small crack and suspicion that had slowly, patiently widened into something like community. "Thank you," she told Chester quietly, as Luke and Silas began arranging the details of transport for the following morning. "Don't thank me yet." Chester's eyes had gone distant, remembering something old and painful. "My wife wanted to fight Granger in court back when he first came at our land. I told her it wasn't worth the trouble, that a small rancher couldn't win against a man with his kind of money and influence. We took the loss instead, sold at half what the land was worth just to make him stop circling." His jaw tightened. She died 2 winters back, still angry about it, I think, though she never said so outright. Watching you two prove me wrong about what was possible." He cleared his throat roughly. "Let's just say I'm glad to help finish what I never had the courage to start myself." "Bate." The hay arrived the next morning, wagon after wagon of it, and the whole ranch turned out to unload and stack it into the one remaining barn, the physical labor a welcome outlet for 2 weeks of accumulated tension. Hannah worked alongside the men hauling bales until her arms ached and her back screamed in protest, and found something almost meditative in the simple, honest exhaustion of it after weeks of paperwork and courtroom strategy. It was mid-afternoon, sweat-soaked and dust-covered, when Silas approached her during a break, working his hat between his hands, in the particular awkward way she'd learned meant he had something difficult to say. "Miss Brooks. Hannah." He cleared his throat. "Been meaning to say something to you since the courthouse, and kept losing my nerve for it." "What is it, Silas?" "When you first walked onto this ranch, I treated you about as poorly as a man can treat another person he's just met." His weathered face had gone red, the words clearly costing him something. "Told you a killer horse would kill you inside a week. Told the boys you were a fool woman who didn't understand her place. Made your first days here harder than they needed to be on top of everything else you were already carrying." He looked up, meeting her eyes with visible effort. "I was wrong about the horse. I was wrong about you. And I've been trying to figure out these past weeks how a man admits that properly, instead of just muttering an apology once and hoping it settles the matter." Hannah studied him a long moment, seeing past the gruff exterior to something genuinely troubled underneath. "You don't have to make grand speeches about it, Silas. You've shown me who you are in every day since that first apology, standing beside Luke in that courtroom, riding out to gather cattle in the heat, without complaint, working this hay, same as any hand half your age. Actions carry more weight than speeches ever do. Still." He shifted his weight, working up to something further. "I thought I understood strength back before you came. Thought it looked like a man who never bent, never doubted, never admitted a mistake out loud. Watching you handle that Mare handle, Granger handle every fool thing this ranch and this county threw at you without once losing your composure." He shook his head slowly. "Turns out I never understood strength at all. Not really. Not until I watched you show me what it actually looks like." Hannah felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. "That might be the kindest thing anyone said to me since my husband died, Silas Boone." "Well..." He cleared his throat again, clearly uncomfortable with the emotion in the moment, and jammed his hat back onto his head with more force than necessary. "Don't go telling the boys I got sentimental. Ruin my reputation. Your secret's safe." He nodded once, gruff and satisfied, and turned back toward the hay wagons, and Hannah watched him go with something warm settling into the space where old grief had lived for so long, the slow, unexpected gift of finding family in a place she'd arrived at with nothing but a carpetbag and a desperate need for honest work. The territorial inquiry in Cheyenne stretched across 3 grueling days, and Hannah testified twice, once regarding her own 4-year-old case against Granger, and once regarding the pattern of sabotage against Mason Ridge specifically. She sat in a much grander courtroom than the county hearing had been, faced a panel of territorial judges instead of a single tired magistrate, and felt the full weight of the proceedings settle onto her shoulders like a physical thing. Granger's lawyers fought harder here. More resources at their disposal, more room to maneuver, and twice Hannah found herself facing sharp, aggressive cross-examination, clearly designed to rattle her composure and cast doubt on her motives. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Brooks?" Granger's lead counsel said, pacing before her with theatrical deliberation, "that you personally stand to benefit enormously from Mr. Mason's ranch surviving intact, that your testimony here today is motivated not by justice, but by simple self-interest, given your relationship with the ranch's owner." "I stand to benefit from the truth being told, sir," Hannah said evenly. "The same truth that would have applied whether or not I'd ever met Mr. Mason. Mr. Granger tried to defraud me 4 years before I'd ever set foot on Mason Ridge. That fraud is a matter of public court record, independent of anything that's happened since. Convenient, isn't it, that you happened to land on the one ranch in the territory that Mr. Granger was also targeting? Not convenient. Predictable, actually. Once you understand how many ranches in this territory Mr. Granger has targeted with nearly identical methods. Hannah kept her voice level, though her pulse hammered. I've heard since the county hearing from no fewer than 6 other landowners with strikingly similar stories. Perhaps the coincidence, sir, isn't that I encountered Mr. Granger twice. Perhaps the coincidence is that so few of his victims have found the resources to speak up until now. A murmur rippled through the gallery, and the lead judge, a stern woman named Justice Aldridge, the first female territorial judge Hannah had ever encountered, which struck her as its own small, quiet victory, leaned forward with sharp interest. Mrs. Brooks, are you aware of these other 6 landowners by name? Several of them, Your Honor. I'd be glad to provide what information I have to assist this inquiry. Granger's lawyer opened his mouth to object, but Justice Aldridge cut him off with a single sharp gesture. The court will hear it. Please continue, Mrs. Brooks. By the time Hannah stepped down from the stand, the tide in that courtroom had shifted so decisively that even Granger's own counsel seemed to sense the case slipping beyond salvage. Over the following 2 days, witness after witness added their own thread to the growing tapestry of fraud Chester Voss's testimony about his family's lost acreage. Otis Pruitt's repeated and increasingly detailed confession, a bank examiner's report showing years of coordinated financial pressure applied against no fewer than 9 separate ranching families across 3 counties. On the final day, as the territorial panel retired to deliberate, Hannah sat beside Luke in the crowded hallway outside the courtroom, both of them wrung out from 3 days of tension, and found herself unable to sit still. Whatever happens in there, Luke said quietly, taking her hand. You already changed something that was broken in this territory long before either of us knew the other existed. That doesn't depend on a verdict. I know. Hannah's voice came out unsteady. I just want it finished, Luke. I want to stop looking over my shoulder for the next fence. He cuts the next lien. He forges the next lie he plants in a newspaper. I want to build something instead of constantly defending what we've already built. We will. He squeezed her hand. Soon. The panel deliberated for 6 hours. When they finally returned, Justice Aldridge's expression gave nothing away as she read the findings of formal indictment against Harold Granger on multiple counts of fraud, extortion, and destruction of property, with additional charges pending against Wade Coulter for his direct role in the fence cutting and cattle sabotage. Granger's assets were ordered frozen pending trial. His business licenses suspended his standing in 3 counties, effectively dismantled in a single afternoon. Granger sat rigid through the entire reading, his face gone the color of old ash, and when the proceedings finally ended, he was led from the courtroom in restraints, his lawyer trailing behind him with the defeated posture of a man already calculating how much of his reputation would survive, representing a client this thoroughly exposed. He didn't look at Hannah as he passed. She hadn't expected him to. Men like Granger, she'd learned, only ever looked at people when they believed they held power over them. And in that courtroom, for the first time in longer than Hannah could imagine, Harold Granger held power over absolutely no one at all. They rode back to Mason Ridge 3 days later, exhausted, but lighter than either of them had felt in months, and found the ranch transformed in their absence, not physically. Though the new barn frame was already rising where the burned one had stood. Timber donated by 3 separate neighboring ranches once word of the verdict spread. Transformed instead in something harder to name, some collective exhale that had swept through the whole outfit the moment news of Granger's indictment reached them. Ruth met them at the gate with tears standing in her eyes, unashamed. It's done, she said. Really done. The trial's still ahead, Hannah cautioned, though even she couldn't fully suppress the hope rising in her chest. This was the indictment, not the conviction. Won't matter, Silas said, coming up beside Ruth with a rare, unguarded grin. Man's already lost everything that made him dangerous. Reputation, standing, money frozen up tight as a drum. Whatever a jury decides down the road, Harold Granger's finished in this territory, and everybody from here to Cheyenne knows it. That evening the whole ranch gathered for a meal that felt less like ordinary supper and more like celebration. Long tables dragged together in the yard, Ruth's best cooking laid out alongside contributions from neighboring ranches, grateful for what Mason Ridge had helped expose. Chester Voss rode in with his own family, toasting Luke and Hannah with a battered tin cup raised high. "To truth," he said, finally outrunning a lie that had a 2-year head start. "To truth." The whole yard echoed, and Hannah felt her eyes burn with unexpected emotion, surrounded suddenly by more genuine community than she'd known in the 8 lonely months since her husband's death. More, if she was honest with herself, than she'd known in years before, that in a marriage that had gone quiet and distant, long before illness ever took him. Margaret Ellison arrived late unexpectedly, dressed less formally than usual, and carrying a basket of preserves she'd made herself. "I wanted to bring something," she said a little awkwardly, holding the basket out to Hannah. "Seemed wrong to arrive with nothing but old suspicion given everything you've done for this county." "Thank you, Margaret." Hannah took the basket, genuinely touched. "I've been thinking," Margaret continued, "about starting a proper legal aid fund through the social committee. For families who can't afford to fight fraud, the way you did, who don't have the knowledge to read the paperwork, the way you clearly do. Would you consider advising on it? Teaching other women, other widows, how to protect themselves, the way you protected yourself." Hannah felt something settle into place inside her, some sense of purpose extending beyond her own survival into something that might genuinely help others walk the same hard road she'd walked alone. "I'd be honored," she said. Margaret's stiff composure finally cracked into something like a genuine smile. "Good. I have a feeling this county's about to become a good deal harder for men like Harold Granger to operate in." Joe. Later, after the tables had been cleared and most of the ranch had drifted off toward well-earned sleep, Hannah found herself once more at Tempest's paddock. The mare's dark shape calm and steady in the moonlight, newly shod hooves silent against the soft earth. Luke joined her there, as he had so many evenings now, leaning against the fence rail beside her with the particular ease of a man who'd finally stopped bracing for the next disaster. "Been thinking," he said. About everything that brought you here. The husband you lost, the land you fought for, and still lost anyway, despite winning that fight. The 7 miles you walked that first morning with nothing but a carpet bag and more grit than any person deserves to need. He turned to face her, fully moonlight catching the earnest weight in his expression. "I keep thinking that all of that, every hard thing you survived, led you here, to this ranch, to this horse, to me." "I've thought the same thing," Hannah admitted quietly. "Wondered sometimes if grief has a purpose, or if it's just cruelty with no meaning behind it. I still don't fully know the answer. But I know I wouldn't trade the woman I became from surviving it, even to have avoided the pain in the first place." "I don't want to rush you," Luke said. "I know it hasn't been long. I know we've both got old wounds that don't heal on anybody else's timeline. But I've spent 3 years telling myself the ranch was enough, that work was enough, that I didn't need anything else to feel like my life had purpose." His voice roughened. "You walked into that paddock a month and a half ago and proved that wrong within the first 5 minutes I watched you. Everything since has just been more proof piling up faster than I know what to do with." Hannah reached out and took his hand, steady now, in a way it hadn't been that first uncertain night at this same fence rail. "I'm not going anywhere, Luke. Whatever comes next, the trial, the ranch, whatever fresh trouble the territory throws at us, I'm not walking away from any of it. Not from this ranch, not from Tempest, and not from you." He looked at her for a long moment, something vulnerable and hopeful moving behind his tired eyes, and Hannah felt the last of her old grief settle into something gentler, something that no longer felt like a wound, but like a foundation proof that she'd survived the worst thing life could offer her, and had come out the other side, still capable, still whole, still able to build something new from the wreckage, instead of merely surviving inside it. Tempest shifted in the moonlight, ears flicking toward them both with the calm, curious attention of a creature who'd learned, same as Hannah, had exactly what it meant to finally stop being afraid. The trial itself came 4 months later, once the territorial prosecutor had finished building the full case against Harold Granger, and by then, the ranch had settled into a rhythm that felt for the first time since Hannah's arrival less like survival and more like something worth calling a life. She rode to Cheyenne with Luke for the final proceedings. And this time, she sat in the gallery instead of the witness stand, her testimony already given, her part in the machinery of justice already done. It was strange to watch instead of fight, and stranger still to watch a jury of 12 men take less than 3 hours to convict Harold Granger on every count brought against him. He didn't look at her as the verdict was read. He didn't look at anyone. He sat with his hands folded on the table in front of him, staring at some fixed point on the floor, and Hannah found she felt none of the fierce satisfaction she'd imagined she might feel in this moment. Only a quiet, tired relief, the kind that came from finally setting down a weight she'd been carrying so long, she'd nearly forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. 15 years, Luke murmured beside her once the sentencing was read. Fraud, extortion, conspiracy to destroy property. 15 years. It's not the years that matter, Hannah said quietly. It's that nobody else in this territory has to be afraid of him again. Outside the courthouse, Chester Voss found them on the steps. His weathered face lit with something Hannah hadn't seen in him before. Not quite joy, but its close cousin, the particular lightness of a man who'd carried grief and injustice so long he'd forgotten it could ever lift. My wife would have wanted to see this day, he said, voice thick. Wanted it more than I ever let myself hope for. She'd be proud of you for finally speaking up, Hannah said. That took as much courage as anything that happened in that courtroom. Chester nodded, unable to speak further for a moment, and simply gripped Luke's hand, and then Hannah's in turn, a wordless gratitude passing between them that needed no further explanation. They rode home in comfortable silence, the territory around them opening up wide and gold under the late summer sun, and somewhere along that long ride, Hannah felt something shift inside her. Not the sharp, adrenaline-charged relief of the verdict itself, but something slower and deeper. The sense of a chapter of her life finally closing so that another could properly begin. What happens now? She asked when they stopped to water the horses at a creek crossing halfway home. Now, Luke said, we build. No more looking over our shoulders. No more waiting for the next disaster Granger's going to throw at us. Just building the way I always meant this ranch to be built before he started making that impossible. Building what exactly? Luke was quiet a moment, watching the water move over smooth stones, and when he spoke again there was a careful weight to his words, like he'd been turning them over for a while before finding the courage to say them aloud. I want to expand the horse program, he said. Properly this time, not just cattle with a few horses on the side. Tempest proved something out there in that paddock. The first day you walked onto this land proved that patience and understanding can turn even the most written-off animal into something extraordinary. I want to build a breeding operation around that. Around what you know, what you've proven you can do that no other horseman in this territory has managed. Hannah felt her pulse quicken, not with fear this time, but with something closer to the old excitement she used to feel as a girl watching her father work with green colts on her family's land before everything had gone wrong. You're talking about a real operation. Byers' bloodline's the kind of reputation that draws attention from beyond the county. I am. That's not a small undertaking, Luke. No, he agreed. It's not. Which is why I don't want to do it as your employer, Hannah. I want to do it as your partner. She turned to look at him fully, and found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. I've been thinking about this for weeks, he continued before she could respond. Watching you work these horses. Watching you handle the ledgers better than I ever could. Watching you fight for this ranch harder than half the men who've drawn a wage here for years. You're not staff, Hannah. Haven't been for a long time now, if we're honest with ourselves. I want to make it official. Equal partner. Equal say in every decision this ranch makes going forward. Equal stake in whatever we build from here. Hannah's throat tightened, old instincts rising up in her, the instinct to protect herself, to hold something back in case it was taken away again, the way everything else in her life had been taken from her without warning. But underneath that old fear, something steadier had been growing for months now, quiet and patient, as the trust she'd built with a wounded mare, and it was that steadier thing that answered him. I have some capital, she said slowly. The proceeds from selling my old homestead once the estate finally settled after the Granger case. It's not a fortune, but it's not nothing either. If we're going to be partners, Luke, I want to be a partner in truth, not just in name. I want to invest in this. I want my name on the deed alongside yours." Something in Luke's face broke open at that relief, and joy tangled together so completely that for a moment he couldn't speak at all. "Mason and Brooks," he finally said, "has a decent ring to it." "Brooks and Mason." Hannah corrected, a smile finally breaking through despite herself. "Alphabetical order, Mr. Mason. Even in partnership, some principles don't bend." He laughed, then a real laugh, unguarded in a way she'd rarely heard from him, and for a moment the whole territory around them seemed to hold that sound like something precious. Something earned through every hard month that had led them to this creek crossing. This decision. This quiet, certain future they were choosing together. Whoa. The paperwork took another 6 weeks to finalize. Hannah insisted on doing it properly. Every clause reviewed, every contingency accounted for the same careful thoroughness that had once saved her own land and then saved Luke's. By the time Mason and Brooks Horse Company was officially registered with the Territorial Land Office, autumn had settled fully over Wyoming, the cottonwoods along the creek gone gold, the morning sharp with the first real bite of the coming winter. Tempest, by then, had become something of a local legend in her own right. Word had spread through the territory of the killer Mare. Tamed not through force, but through patience. And ranchers from 3 counties over had begun making the long ride to Mason Ridge, just to see her. Some out of simple curiosity, others with a more practical interest, wondering whether the same methods might work on their own troublesome stock. "You've got a line of people at the gate again," Ruth announced one crisp October morning, poking her head into the kitchen where Hannah was reviewing the week's accounts. "Man says he rode 2 days from Clear over near Fort Laramie. Heard about the horse whisperer at Mason Ridge and wants to see for himself." Horse whisperer. Hannah shook her head, a little embarrassed by the title that had somehow attached itself to her over the past months. "I don't do anything mystical, Ruth. I just pay attention to what the animal's actually telling me, instead of what I want it to tell me. Try explaining that to a man who rode 2 days to see it." Ruth's eyes crinkled with amusement. "Better get out there. And Luke says to tell you Silas found another prospect worth looking at over near the Bar J spread. Owner's about ready to shoot the animal rather than deal with it anymore." Hannah set down her pencil, already reaching for her coat. Some things she'd learned mattered more than ledgers, and a horse someone was ready to give up on entirely was exactly the kind of thing that had brought her to this ranch in the first place. The visitor from Fort Laramie turned out to be a rancher named Amos Whitfield, a broad-weathered man with an anxious energy that reminded Hannah faintly of Luke on the day she'd first arrived, a man carrying more worry than he knew how to voice properly. "Got a stallion back home?" he said, standing awkwardly at the gate with his hat in his hands. "Fine animal. Best bloodline I've ever owned. But he's turned mean since a fall he took last spring, threw a rider bad enough the man near lost the use of his leg, and now nobody on my whole outfit will go near him. I was fixing to sell him for slaughter price just to be rid of the risk, but—" He stopped working his jaw. "Heard what you did with the Mason mare. Figured it was worth the ride to ask if there was another way." "There's almost always another way," Hannah said. "But I won't lie to you, Mr. Whitfield. Sometimes an animal's pain runs deeper than patience alone can fix, especially if there's an injury underneath the fear that hasn't properly healed. I'd need to see him myself before I could tell you honestly whether he's a horse worth saving or a horse in genuine suffering that mercy would serve better than persistence." Amos nodded slowly, something like relief crossing his weathered face at her honesty. "That's fairer than I expected, ma'am. Most folks either promise miracles or write him off without ever looking close. Appreciate you doing neither. When can you have him brought over? End of the week if that suits." "It suits fine." Luke, watching from the porch as Amos rode off, crossed the yard to join her, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You know this is going to keep happening. Words spreading faster than we can keep up with. Every difficult horse in 3 counties is going to end up at our gate eventually." "Is that a complaint?" "It's an observation." He slid an arm around her waist, easy and natural now, after months of a partnership that had grown into something far deeper than either of them had dared name at first. "I'm thinking we need to build a proper training facility. Not just handle these horses one at a time as they show up at the gate, but build something real, a program with proper pens, proper staff. Maybe even teach some of what you know to men who want to learn it, instead of relying on force out of ignorance. You want to build a school. I want to build whatever it takes to make what you do here something that outlasts just the two of us," Luke said. "Something that changes how this whole territory thinks about handling difficult animals. Maybe even difficult people, if we're being honest about what you actually taught this ranch these past months." Hannah leaned into him, watching Amos Whitfield's dust trail disappear over the horizon, and felt the shape of a future opening up in front of her that she couldn't have imagined the day she'd walked 7 miles under a punishing sun, with nothing but a carpetbag and a desperate need to prove she still had something worth offering the world. "Let's build it," she said. Suck. The stallion Amos brought over that Friday was indeed a magnificent animal, a deep chestnut with a build that spoke of generations of careful breeding and eyes that carried the same rigid defensive fear Hannah had seen in Tempest all those months ago, though laced now with something rawer, more physical. She spent 3 days simply observing him before she ever attempted contact, watching the particular way he favored his left hind leg, when he thought no one was looking, the flinch that crossed his whole body whenever anyone approached from his blind side. "There's an old injury there," she told Amos on the third evening, both of them leaning against the fence watching the stallion pace the far end of his temporary paddock. "Not just fear from the fall, actual lingering pain in that hindquarter. I'd wager whoever's been trying to handle him since hasn't accounted for that, approached him expecting defiance, when what they were actually getting was an animal in genuine physical distress that nobody bothered to properly examine." Amos's face went slack with something between guilt and revelation. "We had the vet out after the fall. Man said he'd heal up fine with rest. Maybe he did heal mostly, but something's still wrong back there, or he wouldn't be favoring it this consistently, this long after the fact." Hannah's jaw set with quiet determination. "I want to bring in a proper veterinarian before I do anything further with him. No sense building trust with an animal if the very foundation of his fear is a pain nobody's actually addressed." The veterinarian, an older man from Laramie, with decades of experience, confirmed exactly what Hannah suspected: a hairline fracture in the hip that had healed poorly, leaving the joint chronically inflamed and sensitive to the kind of pressure a saddle and rider would naturally apply. "Wonder as he's been rideable at all these past months," the vet said, shaking his head. "Man's lucky the horse hasn't done worse than throw somebody. Animal's been in genuine agony every time somebody's forced weight onto that hindquarter." Amos went pale, understanding dawning slow and painful across his weathered face. "I nearly had him put down for meanness, and the whole time he was in pain and nobody was listening," Hannah said, not unkindly, though the words carried a weight that went beyond horses, beyond this particular stallion, reaching all the way back to every misunderstood, mishandled creature she'd ever encountered, human and animal alike. "It's the easiest mistake in the world to make, Mr. Whitfield. Don't punish yourself for it. Just do right by him now that you know." With proper treatment and months of patient rehabilitation, the stallion Amos named him. Reckoning in a gesture Hannah found unexpectedly poetic, slowly began to trust hands near that tender hindquarter again. And by the time winter fully settled over the territory, he'd become the second great success story of Mason and Brooks Horse Company, a living testament to the difference between force and understanding, between assuming the worst of a creature's behavior and actually investigating the truth beneath it. The training program grew faster than either Hannah or Luke had anticipated. By the following spring, they'd built proper facilities, a training pen separate from the main working corrals, a small covered arena for working horses through bad weather, and a rough bunkhouse annex for the handful of young hands who'd come specifically to learn Hannah's methods, rather than simply to work cattle. One of them, a serious, quiet young woman named Sarah Kettering, had ridden in from a struggling homestead nearly 40 miles distant, having heard through relatives about a training program that would take on students regardless of gender, provided they showed the patience and dedication the work demanded. My father says horse training's no business for a woman, Sarah told Hannah on her first day, chin lifted with the particular defiance Hannah recognized instantly, having worn that same expression herself not so very long ago. Told me I was wasting good labor that should go toward the family's own stock. What do you think? Hannah asked. I think I've got a gift for it that nobody in my family's bothered to notice on account of I'm not a son. Sarah's jaw was tight, guarded, clearly bracing for rejection. Heard you built all this from nothing but a carpetbag and a horse everybody else had given up on. Figured if anybody would take a chance on somebody like me, it'd be you. Something in Hannah's chest tightened with recognition so sharp it nearly ached. You're right that I understand exactly what you're carrying, Sarah, and you're right that I'll take a chance on you. But I want you to understand something before we begin. The chance I'm giving you isn't charity, and it isn't sympathy either. It's an opportunity to prove through your own work exactly what you're capable of. Nobody here is going to hand you anything you haven't earned. That's not unkindness. That's respect. Sarah's eyes, which had been carefully guarded since she'd arrived, softened slightly at that. That's fair. It's the only way I know how to teach, Hannah said. Or the only way that ever meant anything to me, at least. Sarah proved over the following months to be a genuinely gifted student patient, in a way few young people managed, observant in the particular quiet way that the work demanded, and by midsummer she'd become skilled enough that Hannah trusted her with some of the harder cases coming through the gate on their own recognizance. You've got real talent, Hannah told her one evening, watching Sarah work a nervous yearling through basic groundwork with a steadiness that belied her age. Talent I didn't have to teach you, just had to give you the room to discover it. That's what you did for Tempest, Sarah said. Isn't it? Room to discover what she already had in her, instead of trying to force something into her that wasn't natural. That's exactly what I did. Hannah felt a swell of something like pride watching this young woman who reminded her so much of herself find her footing in a world that had told her from birth that her gifts didn't matter. That's the whole philosophy, Sarah. Every difficult creature, horse, or person usually already has what it needs inside itself. The work isn't building something new into them. It's clearing away whatever's been stopping them from trusting what's already there. It was that same summer, nearly a full year after Hannah had first walked through the gates of Mason Ridge, with nothing but a carpetbag and desperate determination, that Luke found her early one morning down by the creek, sitting quietly with her boots off and her feet in the cool water, watching the sunrise paint the whole valley gold. You're up early, he said, settling down beside her. Couldn't sleep. Too much on my mind. Good thoughts, I hope. Mostly. She glanced at him sideways, a small private smile tugging at her mouth. I was thinking about the day I walked in here. How certain I was that I had nothing left, that I was simply looking for enough work to survive another season. I never imagined. She gestured vaguely at the ranch behind them, the training pens, the new barn, the life they'd built together from the wreckage of two separate griefs. I never imagined any of this. Luke was quiet a moment, and when Hannah glanced at him again, she found him watching her with an expression she recognized instantly, the same careful, deliberate weight he'd carried that afternoon at the creek crossing when he'd first proposed their partnership. I've been thinking too, he said, about what this past year's taught me, about how close I came to losing this ranch entirely, and how much closer I came to losing something even more important, the belief that I still had a life worth building beyond just surviving my own grief. He reached into his coat pocket, and Hannah's breath caught as she watched him produce a small velvet box, worn soft at the edges. Clearly, something he'd carried around for longer than she'd realized. Luke, let me say this properly, Hannah. I've been working up the courage for weeks now. His hands weren't quite steady as he opened the box, revealing a simple gold band, unadorned but clearly chosen with care. You walked into my life on the worst day I'd had in 3 years, and you didn't just save this ranch. You saved something in me I'd stopped believing could be saved, the part that still wanted to build a future instead of just enduring whatever was left of the past. His voice roughened. I'm not asking you to marry me because I rescued you that first day at the gate. You never needed rescuing, not from me, not from anyone. I'm asking because you transformed this ranch, and you transformed me, and you did it all without ever once asking for anything in return, except the chance to prove what you were capable of." Hannah's eyes had filled unbidden the same way they had that first morning in Tempest's paddock, and she found she could barely speak past the tightness in her throat. "You don't need to ask me anything, Luke Mason," she finally managed. "You could have simply told me, and I'd have said yes before you finished the sentence." "That's not really a yes, though. Not officially." A laugh broke through her tears, unexpected and full. "Yes, yes, Luke. 1,000 times yes." He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that had gone entirely unsteady now, and Hannah threw her arms around his neck, laughing and crying at once, feeling every hard mile of the past year, the grief, the fear, the courtroom battles, the fires and forgeries, and slow, patient trust, rebuilt one small victory at a time, settle finally into something that felt unmistakably like peace. Somewhere behind them, drawn by some instinct only horses seemed to possess, Tempest had wandered down from her pasture to the edge of the creek, and stood now watching the two of them with dark, steady eyes, ears pricked forward in calm curiosity. She nosed gently at Hannah's shoulder, insistent, and Hannah pulled back from Luke just enough to press her forehead against the mare's velvet nose, laughing through fresh tears. "You approve, do you?" she murmured. Tempest huffed out a breath that sounded absurdly exactly like the satisfied sound she'd made that very first night at the fence rail, and Luke laughed outright, wrapping his arms around both Hannah and the horse at once, as if he could somehow hold the whole improbable hard-won shape of his new life together in a single embrace. The wedding took place that autumn, a modest affair by most standards, but attended by nearly the entire county, word having spread of the ceremony, the way word spread of everything remarkable that happened at Mason Ridge these days. Ruth wept openly through the entire service, having appointed herself unofficial matriarch of the occasion and taken personal charge of every dish served at the reception afterward. Silas stood as Luke's best man, gruffly proud in a suit that clearly hadn't been worn in years, and delivered a toast so unexpectedly heartfelt that even Hannah found herself surprised by the depth of emotion in his weathered voice. "Never thought I'd stand up here and say a woman taught me more about strength than any man I've ever worked beside," he said, raising his glass with a hand that trembled slightly. "But there it is, plain truth, same as she always insisted on." He looked at Hannah, and something old and grateful passed between them. "Glad you walked 7 miles to get here, ma'am. Ranch wouldn't be half of what it's become without you." Margaret Ellison attended too. Seated near the front, alongside several members of the county's legal aid committee, Hannah had helped establish over the past year a small but growing organization that had already helped 4 separate families successfully contest fraudulent land claims using exactly the methods Hannah herself had once pioneered alone and unsupported. Chester Voss brought his own contribution to the celebration, a young colt from his own breeding stock offered as a wedding gift with the shy, awkward generosity of a man unused to expressing gratitude in words. Figured Mason and Brooks Horse Company ought to start its official breeding line with proper ceremony, he said, handing over the lead rope with visible pride. "This colt's got good bones. Good temperament, too, from what I've seen of him so far. Seemed fitting he should start his life here, given everything this place has come to mean." Sarah Kettering, now a full year into her training under Hannah's guidance, stood near the back of the gathering with 2 other young women who'd since joined the program. All 3 watching the ceremony with an unmistakable hunger in their expressions. Not envy precisely, but recognition. The particular look of young women who'd found in Hannah Brooks proof that the life they wanted for themselves wasn't as impossible as the world had always insisted it was. And Tempest, decorated for the occasion with ribbons woven through her mane, despite considerable initial protest, stood tethered nearby throughout the ceremony, drawing nearly as much attention from the gathered guests as the bride and groom themselves. The living, breathing centerpiece of the story that had brought this whole unlikely community together in the first place. Winter came again, and with it the quiet satisfaction of a year fully closed, a cycle completed. Mason and Brooks Horse Company had by then become one of the most respected breeding and training operations in the entire territory, drawing buyers from as far as Denver and Salt Lake City, all seeking horses raised and trained under methods that had proven again and again superior to the old brutal traditions of force and domination. Hannah sat in the ranch office one evening that winter, reviewing the year's final accounts by lamplight, and found herself struck by the particular satisfaction of watching numbers on a page tell a story of genuine transformation. Not just financial success, though the ledgers reflected that too, but something deeper, harder to quantify. 9 horses successfully rehabilitated that year alone. Animals other ranchers had been ready to destroy. 4 young trainees, 3 of them women, learning skills that would carry them through lives their families had once insisted were closed to them. A legal aid fund that had already saved 2 more families from the kind of predatory fraud that had once nearly cost Hannah everything. Luke found her there, as he so often did these days, and settled into the chair across from her with the easy familiarity of a man fully at home in his own life. "Good year?" he asked. "The best year?" Hannah said, setting down her pencil. "Not because nothing went wrong. Plenty went wrong, if you remember. The fire, the lean, Reckoning's fractured hip, every single difficult thing that's happened these past 12 months. She looked up at him, something soft and certain in her expression. "The best year, because we faced every single one of those difficulties together, and came out the other side stronger for it, instead of broken by it." That's not luck, Luke. That's what happens when 2 people decide deliberately to build something worth protecting, instead of simply surviving whatever life throws at them. Luke reached across the desk and took her hand, the gold band on her finger catching the lamplight. "I used to think strength meant never needing anybody, never asking for help, never admitting when something was too much to carry alone." His thumb traced gentle circles over her knuckles. "You taught this whole ranch something different. That real strength is knowing exactly when to lean on somebody else and having the wisdom to build a life full of people worth leaning on. Silas taught me that too in his own way," Hannah said softly. "And Ruth, and Chester, and Margaret, and every person in this county who chose eventually to stand up and tell the truth even when it cost them something to do it. I didn't build any of this alone, Luke. None of us did." Outside the office window, snow had begun falling soft and steady over the ranch, settling white over the training pens. The new barn, the paddock where a killer horse named Tempest had once terrified an entire outfit of hardened cowboys, and now stood calm and trusting at the very foundation of everything they'd built together. Hannah rose from the desk and crossed to the window, watching the snow fall, and felt the full weight of everything the past year and a half had taught her settle into something permanent, something she carried now not as grief but as hard-won wisdom. She had arrived at Mason Ridge with nothing but a carpetbag and a desperate need to prove her own worth to a world that had already decided before she'd said a single word that a grieving widow had nothing left to offer. She had proven that world wrong, not through anger, not through force, but through the same patient, unshakable truth she'd once whispered to a terrified mare in a paddock that had broken every man who'd tried to tame it before her. Fear didn't disappear because someone was stronger. It disappeared when someone finally listened to the pain underneath the defiance, to the grief underneath the fear, to the quiet, stubborn hope that survived even in the wreckage of everything a person had once believed their life would be. She had built a home from that truth, a family, a future neither she nor Luke had believed themselves capable of finding again after everything they'd separately lost. And somewhere out in the gathering snow, Tempest stood steady in the paddock that had once been her prison, and had become instead the place where an entire ranch and 2 broken hearts had finally learned what it truly meant to heal. Hannah Brooks had walked 7 miles under a merciless sun with nothing left to lose, and had found at the end of that long road everything she never dared to hope for again. Trust rebuilt one patient hour at a time. Justice earned through truth instead of vengeance. A partnership built on equal respect instead of rescue. A love that asked nothing of her except exactly who she already was. Whatever the world had once told her about what a widow a woman alone could accomplish, Mason Ridge Ranch stood now as living, undeniable proof of precisely how wrong that world had been. And Hannah Brooks, standing at the window with snow falling soft and endless over everything she'd built, knew with complete and unshakable certainty that she would never again let anyone convince her otherwise.